I don't edit my own recordings, so they're always, uh, in my mind, a potential source of embarrassment. I don't upload things because there are certain points which I knew could be argued much more effectively, but I think I'm going to just try to uh, sort of break that anxiousness and just upload anyway, just so that there is at least something on the matter rather than leaving nothing, essentially. Because I don't do the work of painstakingly structuring what I'm going to say, although I do think quite deeply about these topics. When I come to recording, I always don't um, traverse the same material to the same quality that I did in the first place of considering the matter. Um, I want to talk a lot. I have many things to say about this very complicated, or it's not that complicated, but no, it is, because it involves a lot of facets, which sadly you have to kind of go down all these small little rabbit holes. This is why I don't upload some of my work, because when I get into the kind of uh, the basic kind of, I try to give a kind of realist estimation as to the some of the factors which, for example, um, explain obvious disparities and asymmetries, because men and women have different strategies. They by and large, generally speaking, um, they do conform to different rubrics of, and this is largely because of the huge impact that hormones have on the development of the body, and the brain in particular. Um, there are huge differences between boys and girls at very, very young ages, because like there's something like there's more testosterone in a baby boy than sort of uh, per unit blood than like at the the, the peak of puberty, and also at sort of the general peak of testosterone, which I think peaks at around 35 or something like that for men. But and it has a huge impact on the structure of the brain. Um, so much so that you can see marked differences in interest between boys and girls when they are playing, and these are not culturally. Anyway, to talk about such stupid topics, which should never be controversial, but everything in this clown world of delusional, kind of, it's so poisonous when essentially you're arguing against something that is trying to essentially make a moral argument about what ought to be, and therefore gives itself the leeway to kind of ignore reality completely and be completely delusional. And in some sense, this is because I wanted to get into this on the level of culture, but also talking about sorry, uh, yeah, this is one of the rabbit holes which is a necessary sort of thing to touch on, but I haven't even laid out what I actually want this recording to be about primarily, which is about the international liberal order, and obviously how we seem to be migrating into a different kind of political um, consciousness and epoch. And I want to basically make further arguments in favor of the liberal order, the international liberal order, and how to get back to it, and also how to diagnose its failures, which I do not think were exactly the failures of the international liberal order itself. Um, there's this American, he always calls himself a dinosaur, who's kind of like was into real politics, and he's always talking about the international orders and the great powers and real politics, which we're sort of coming back into now. I can't remember his name. It starts with an M, I believe. so embarrassing. Anyway, he talks about how we're moving to a kind of because we're moving away from being a unipolar because we're moving away from being a unipolar world, balance of power politics comes back into force, and therefore we're not going to have the international liberal order. And then he also sort of opines on the side about how the international liberal order worked badly against certain nationalistic elements, and there is something to that. But the argument that he makes around that, I think, is actually quite wrong. That all this open border stuff has got nothing to do with the international liberal order. That has got to do with corrupt municipal elites that are tapping into the identity politics conflict theory version of politics, and which is somehow taken on the label as liberalist, as being a political liberal vision that somehow has to do with open borders. Now, in some sense, on some superficial sense, you can get some kind of rhetorical pairing, that there is a correlation between a kind of internationalist values, is thematically perhaps, superficially similar to open borders, but it's like the kind of the oversimplification that is being filtered to make that kind of equivalency is palpably retarded. So I'm going to diagnose what has been defective in the international order, but actually this is going to sound like a conspiracy theory, and I'm going to give my own anecdotal evidence as to why I think that it should be taken seriously. It doesn't really matter if what I'm about to say is true or not, but it certainly does line up in terms of the. But okay, wait, getting to the substantiation before I even make the title heading of my argument. So I'm going to generally try to make a narrative about what's going on in politics on a kind of macro level, on just a pure ideological dissection of what's going on and how it's gone wrong and how it's corrupt. And then I'm going to talk about the failing of culture. So I do think, I think this is a nice way to try and paint a picture of my point of view and my perspective and my worldview, is that we're going to look back on the international liberal order in envy of the people that lived during this time. We are going to wish that we didn't squander the time that we had, and that we didn't perpetuate and prolong that cultural ethos. Now, it's ironic that, the so-called liberals of today, they seem to have that kind of hysterically woven into their ideological, or their ideological programs and their political visions, but they are really pushing a version of so-called liberalism which is so antithetical to having a stable politic. In some sense, it's ironic and hypocritical on some level that they say that they have these enlightened values of humanism or something like that, in terms of wanting to have open borders, but within their borders, within their municipal politics, within their conceptualization of society, they're patently fascistic, they're patently totalitarian, they're completely illiberal. In some sense, they've imported real politics into the municipal domain. The politics of the personal, as they would say, in some kind of conflict theory epithet. the problem with conflict theory is that it basically just table thumps all of its premises. It just presumes them, and it doesn't ever substantiate what it's trying to do. It doesn't have to promote its so-called solutions through making substantiations against opposing points of view. It's unfalsifiable basically, because it's not vulnerable on any point at which it makes an argument, because essentially it doesn't ever make any other kind of argument other than a moral argument. And so because its a structure is based on this kind of prospective moral claim, it never has to prove that the measures, that what it takes is actually practically efficacious or is pragmatically efficient, because it's always morally expedient. So essentially it just makes it makes this general hand-waved, gestured suggestion about itself that it is the most morally expedient form of development, or a way to solve the problems and the ills and the injustices. And in some sense, it only has a definition of injustice. It doesn't have a positive definition of how to develop. It doesn't have a positive definition of equality. Its definition of equality is the removal of injustice, systemic oppression, and inequality and injustice. So, like, it can only negatively negate the problem. It doesn't have a positive definition of the solution. It uses the negative to define justice, essentially. So, it can only explain and describe injustice. And so, what's also quite hypocritical about itself is that, it peddles the thing that it complains about as the problem is also the solution, just kind of fighting fire with fire. And so it has imported this toxic, poisonous, real politics within the municipal domain, which completely dissolves liberal democratic politics. It completely dissolves the public sphere into this kind of totalitarian orthodoxy, because it has claimed this canonical perspective, and it has no intellectual edifice that makes it open to being challenged, because it just assumes that its moral expediency you can't outdo moral expediency. So it's got that kind of absolutist reduction of affairs, and therefore its generalizations that it needs in order to deploy that moral expediency, its group categorization, its collective punishments that it forwards on society, its collective programs, that it associates people with some kind of group guilt and kind of collective shame and all these weird sorts of things that are going on, which are actually the quintessential definition of social injustice in the original sense, in the Orwellian sense of when George Orwell described what social injustice is. They have simply semantically grabbed all of the kind of these phrases, and they have just semantically woven this totalitarian Nazi philosophy, essentially. I mean, it's indistinguishable from fascist philosophy in terms of how they conceptualize society and break down reality into these generalizations, which you can't escape from, or the counter argument. Well, I guess they don't even have a primary argument. That it's just more doubling down and table thumping. Anyway, okay. Let me just think of what novel thing I had to say about this. So it's interesting that they have brought real politics to destabilize democracy, liberal democracy. And I mean, it is actually more insidious and more complicated than this. I would say that the the reason why it's so alluring and how it grows like it does, because it's tactically infiltrated society on multiple levels. It's gotten these symbols of authority, in terms of capturing the liberal arts and academia. Obviously, these institutions were fundamentally weak and open to this kind of onslaught, which it I do think has been funded by bad actors. But even as a kind of psychological animal, you can understand that once it gets going, it has its own propensity within itself to be able to grow, because essentially it functions as a collective conspiracy theory and paranoia of a kind of almost like a collective borderline personality disordered individual. And particularly because vulnerable narcissism can, I believe, be exhibited by an ideological creed. I mean, this is exactly what Nazism was. This is what generally fascism is. Is that as you are a kind of identity essentialist in terms of how you reduce society and interpret society, that also helps you fudge all the practical concerns about not having to motivate for why your policy solution, why you should have to substantiate it, and in pragmatic terms, because it's seen as efficient for the identity. Never mind how that translates into actually affecting people on the ground. Never mind, because essentially, as long as it is redistributing the historical damage onto the right target, onto the right scapegoat, then that redistribution of the historical hurt is the ameliorative process, that is what is affecting social justice in their view. And so it's a kind of it's almost like a mythological recipe, and it doesn't ever have to contend with counterfactuals, because that moral efficiency is seen as paramount. And so you don't ever have to ask practical questions about reality, because you only have to ask questions that are identity-centric. And so, and obviously, plutocrats love this, because it's too easy to craft policy that panders to identitarian ideology that is completely, it by design will create leeway in which people are given things because of superficial reasons, because of their belonging to the identity or some kind of token value, because of the moral tokenism that the whole system is embedded in, means that you can basically have unaccountable power. And so it's this is what it does, is it's the engine of unaccountable power. It is how corrupt African regimes have destroyed their countries since liberations. And you generally just need some kind of conflict. You need some kind of in-group and out-group to obviously the model of the Rainbow Nation was antithetical to this, and so obviously ideologically it's a threat to all regimes that run on that kind of unaccountable power. Identity politics and conflict theory in general is ironically and hypocritically, because what it says, it kind of says, no, this is the only way to change the status quo. It's ironic how many tools and instruments it gives to unaccountable power. because by definition the policy must be an interventionist kind of disruption to over people, essentially, because in some sense the system itself is fundamentally, it's like saying that the status quo is already tinged with a kind of cosmic moral sabotage. Therefore, we need a counter sabotage in order to undermine what is rotten in Denmark. So you have this kind of thing that whatever it models the problem as is what it actually facilitates, and which it labels the countervailing or counteractive necessary solution. So it is exactly what it complains about, ironically. And obviously corrupt elites love this because they've always wanted unaccountable power, and even as they continue to fail and essentially self-sabotage, they can use those failures as yet more fuel for why they need more concentration of power and influence over the system, which is not tending to be corrected by this disgusting deployment of self-sabotage. So culturally, the problem I guess they shouldn't really be called liberals. And I think even there was a time in which even they were moving away from the title liberal. They were saying, no, call us progressives, don't call us liberals, because we don't really have anything to do with liberal philosophy. In fact, I've spoken to a lot of these people and explained how similar they are to fascists. And they say, well, yes, we don't care. We do want justice for the identity. And yeah, I guess the fascists were probably right then, because that is my set of views. They don't care. The bandwagon is all that matters, essentially. The problem is that when you have, all orders within any society or between societies even, or a kind of international ethos, all order that people might enjoy or have at all is a direct consequence of, in some sense, an active contract that people are participating in. Now, what these people have done within almost the liberal context is saying, okay, well, we want to use this power that we have to not participate and to, and we elect to no longer be a contractual participant in liberal society. We're not happy with those rules. We want something that's more expedient, that promises us a more radical, fast-paced way of doing something. And then once they dissolve the liberal structure of society, and then they move to this other thing, which then has even more unaccountable power. Because I would argue that essentially de facto we have already been run into the ground by their style of politics. The idea that if they are able to do it in an unmasked way that's more blatantly totalitarian, and where they're more immediately radical in what it is, that then, this is also how the Nazis eventually got power, is that essentially they demoralized the society so much with their complaints and accusations. And a lot of people that never liked them really actually just thought that if they were given power, that then they would shut up, because then they couldn't complain about the powers that be, because they would have power. But obviously the propaganda gets even worse, the hyperrealism gets even worse, the cherry-picked narrative framing and the mafia style hyperrealism of sustaining this vulnerable narcissism, which is the kind of the ideological bedrock that, you can see examples of this, how people are trained to semantically construct experiences uh, uh, as a kind of borderline decompartmentalizing and disorientating some, poor sap that happen to be in their orbit, within their vicinity, that, because essentially you can just demand certain extractions from people, and that they have to comply, they have to be a compatriot to your ideological vision. You can't, there's no kind of liberal live and let live. It's, no, you have to agree that you have been part of some kind of systemic process of oppression. And that whole thing is a giant diversion from actually tackling any of the problems on the ground. That whole series of obsessive nitpicking according to this moral expediency is just nothing like actually looking at the options available to actually practically dealing with any of the challenges. You get this very strange cartoonish vision of reality and history when you get obsessed with this conflict theory. You forget sort of basic facts that, like, Britain, for instance, is still paying off the debt from World War II. That we can't just because we have this crazy, disorientating, conflict theory driven political climate doesn't mean that, like, the debt that is racked up by the state is not going to be paid at some point, that essentially we're not consigning away. I mean, essentially this is what it does as a general strategy, is it just destabilizes the system by essentially selling the future into slavery. I mean, what does it mean to be a country if your fiscus is just completely has collapsed? It means nothing. You don't have independence, and we haven't had responsible government for so long now that we've just had the style of self-sabotage, essentially. The government won't let the country develop, because it's so obsessed with this kind of centralized, government-centric, and government control of resources, and even contract itself, so that, the proper signals of a win-win scenarios, just can't happen in this atmosphere of just uh, uh, stupendous forms of, I mean, all the systemic filters that they have put onto things. It's the same thing that's driving up the costs of university, for instance, is because they've got too much staff that essentially their only role is to look for grievances of these vulnerable narcissists and to assist them in, making these strange, disorientated senses in which people, they don't have, they're trained essentially to project their ego as a kind of holographic historical conflation onto their environment, so that they can kind of imagine in a kind of hypothetical calculation of identity injustice and identity conflict, so that they can kind of promote this hypersensitivity, which, I mean, essentially, again, I've called it a kind of, it is like a form of borderline personality disorder. And if you didn't have a scapegoat in order to center that reality within, to kind of, you know it's like, how would the Nazi state have survived without the Jewish conspiracy? Because in some sense that's the pressure release valve, and that's the only way that you can keep this delusional bandwagon going. I mean, in some sense, that's the thing that pays for your imagination. And yeah, I mean, this is too complicated to do, but I wanted to almost talk about how badly they do when they create stories and writing in series and movies, and how that can almost, the writing in these stories can be seen as the policy in government policy, and how bad it is. But the story structures that they use and things like that, and the themes that they employ, in some sense, this is why the stories are so two-dimensional, is because it's not about the story, it's about the audience themselves psychologically in some sense. And it's about telling the audience and feeding the audience about their narcissistic snapshots of identity. It's directly sending them messages about those narcissistic snapshots that they have. Because the audience is, in terms of the social justicely themed series, are pitched to vulnerable narcissists. And this is why people who aren't vulnerable narcissists can't tolerate watching it, because it's utter trash. It's just garbage, pandering essentially. But I mean, this is the thing: is that essentially the policy that exists is just there to kind of be more general loudspeaker advocacy for the articles of the faith. Everything is just a kind of the stupid echoing of the same kind of moralistic, absolute, canonical polemic that they are incepting society into. And that is such a secondary sort of ideological necessity for them to make sure that that is seen as the orthodoxy, that they don't ever have to get around to advocating why this policy would even be effective or not. It's not even a question if it's effective or a good use of resources, because it's morally efficient, and that moral efficiency just trumps everything. Which is ironic, because it's morally depraved, it's fundamentally racist, it's fundamentally, everything. It's not non-sexist, it's not non-racialist. It's a betrayal of the South African Constitution, and it essentially puts government policy beyond the rule of law, because you can't challenge it in the basis of Section 36. You would usually be able to limit things by arguing that there's another way of doing it. But that whole test, that whole leg, has been cut off by this disgusting ideology, because the Chief Justice himself is a proponent of this war crime ideology, essentially, of collective punishment and the moral necessity of collective punishment. And this is quintessential social injustice. It really is. But these people don't care. That's how racialistically infused they have become. That is how corrupted they have become. And this moral corruption has precipitated easily anticipatable state corruption and governmental unaccountability and mismanagement. What I was going to say is that I don't even know if I should speculate out loud like this. I'm just going to suggest that on a geopolitical level, you can see maybe who would have found it obvious to bring down the moral core of liberalism. So what I see is kind of the cornerstone of liberal values, real liberal values that are worth saving, is Star Trek: The Next Generation. Now, I don't think how do I put this? Now, where the liberal order, sorry, no, where the liberal order has been failing, it's been failing because of the proclivity and decadence of culture itself, not being astute enough to actually preserve its own cultural edifice. Um, Journalism is a huge problem. We have very poor quality journalism. I mean, perhaps you can say that it's been governed by money and the powerful for so long, um, that it's very capable of mouthing anything as long as it's um, as long as that it's capable of facilitating a level of subterfuge and manipulation of public opinion. And that is perhaps why conflict theory has been so celebrated within the mainstream, as it were, and with the powerful elite. Not the what I would call the truly intellectual elite, and really we're seeing the wheat and the chaff in terms of the so-called intellectual elite. I would say one of the few, I mean, people on the left who I would call, really intellectually capable in these times would be Slavoj Žižek. I'm just trying to think if there's even another name that I can. Chomsky, I mean, I'll give him a free pass because he's obviously old and senile, and so he has completely just fallen into the simplification. I mean, I did think that perhaps one of his strategies is that he would try to essentially get into the identity politics movement and kind of pose a couple of questions to kind of try to level them up in terms of their nuance and sophistication. But that if you can just kind of solve his two challenges, essentially, is that, like, how can you have an identity claim and also still be helpful to other people who are in terms of their other challenges? But these are insoluble problems for identity politics, because it's fundamentally premised in essentially ethno-fascism. Essentially, it is the philosophical conceptualization of ethno-fascism, but they are kind of like I mean, they're kind of like the Nazis. They would still prefer to keep a hold of the Jews, because in some sense, even as they on the outside they profess segregation, but they will continue to use the Jewish conspiracy as a way to vent the pressure in their ideology. Um, so in some sense, it's that same kind of middling compromise where they're happy to be part of a kind of some kind of weirdly superficial construct of multiculturalism, because as long as they have access to their ideological identitarian scapegoat to hang everything on, and also to provide the cover for the vulnerable narcissism that somebody else's accountability is the thing that is the essentially they can just be safely reacting to the prime injustice at the center of their ontological or epistemic universe. And that is also, I guess, one of the major themes that they do, is because essentially they've got this fudged ontological generalization about history. Then they can just essentially, they don't need to make detailed claims about epistemic substantiation about any of their claims or solutions, because the ontology essentially just gets conflated and usable interchangeably. The whole thing just becomes a kind of mythologized mess, and where you just keep on getting this whole secondary economy of these disgusting academics that just create more of this essentially racialist, de facto racial realism propaganda and such, an identitarian echoing of framing society in these terms, so that it can stabilize the bandwagon and keep the political program on track, as it were, of the so-called progress that is being facilitated supposedly through this groupthink. Well, it creates this virtue signaling strata of this unknown quantity of injustice, which will be kind of an inexhaustible resource for political unaccountability. Because as long as you're doing something in that direction, because it's such a vague, murky medium to be tasked with dispensing as political leadership, you are you're actually free to do whatever the hell you want. You have a free reign. You have an invisible hand and expectation to intervene within the system. And so, you don't have a liberal structure. You have an authoritarian nightmare. And it's interesting that as these people take their liberty within the liberal order at the moment to dismantle the liberal structure, when they actually move into the other structure, then they will realize just essentially how they've sold themselves down the river. That you can't just escape once you've captivated yourself by that kind of disgusting identitarian edifice, because then essentially anyone speaking for the identity essentially has free reign essentially, and who decides who is capable of speaking on behalf of the interests of the identity and the rights of the identity and the justice of the identity. It's the biggest tyrant. That's all it is. And essentially all this is what it means to have a society that's made in the image of identitarian, essentially, with the values of ethno-fascism, which is exactly what identity politics is centered in. The idea that your version is going to be more sensitive because it's going to be more focused on stamping out injustice. Well, states can't actually center around a negative vision and a negative program. They actually have to positively do things and structure things. And so the idea that you're going to have this perfect rainbow Hitler arbiter over all affairs that are going to be able to stop people from impinging on each other's all these strange presumptions that are woven into their framework. The idea that any kind of inequality is an iniquity. I heard Ben Shapiro say that. It's a good observation. Anyway, so I when I was into this issue, I was just thought I was going to argue that it's the liberal order that asked for open borders. No, it's corrupt municipal elites that maybe wanted cheaper labor or something like that, or they didn't want to have to care about, because generally when you have open borders, it's worse for the more vulnerable section of your local population, because they have to compete essentially with labor, because usually immigrants that come to a nation have already chosen themselves to do something positive. They've already chosen to go to another country. They are more motivated, generally speaking, and they will generally be of a you know, well, if anything, it dilutes on the bottom scale of the socioeconomic ladder. It makes things, it puts more pressure on the vulnerable part of a population, which there in South Africa there's already. I mean, I guess this is more applicable for countries that were already functioning on some level. South Africa has already been dysfunctional for probably 15 years, in terms of sabotaging its own economic development. When we could have just did what Malaysia did. Malaysia actually, for like, I don't know, I think it was 2 or 4 years, or perhaps it was longer, but I believe they had a very short run. Malaysia actually started dabbling in affirmative action with quotas and things like that, because everyone else was doing it internationally. And then they got some good advice, and they scrapped it. They just removed affirmative action completely. And they stopped essentially using identity politics against their Chinese minority, because Malaysia's got this very interesting sort of makeup. They've got a Chinese minority, which I think is about 10 or 20% of the country, and they hold, by far, they hold more wealth, and they hold more positions of influence in some sense. They are like like most of, like, I think over half of the university graduates are like all Chinese. And in that context, they thought, okay, let's do identity politics quota stuff. Then they scrapped all of that, and they just did the responsible thing. They said, let's not try and divide up society and try to play some social justice game. Let's try just be a good fucking government. Let's just have good fucking governance. How about we just do that? How about we just do what we can to expand development and expand the growth of the economy, so that we have a bigger tax base, so that we have more money to put into primary education. Because university is a minority experience anyway. So how about we just have everyone in our country has a very good quality primary and secondary education, instead of trying to divvy up, amongst some kind of elite plutocracy of some kind of identitarian tokens that were always going to be politically connected anyway, or already going to be people that were on the top of the socioeconomic ladder, people that have the opportunity to make use of the access to the quotas. So you end up, so they actually did the responsible thing, where they just actually tried to develop their country like a fucking non-racialist government should. And now Malaysia is almost a first world country, pretty much. Probably is a first world country. They have a higher per capita income than South Africa does. I mean, it's amazing. I mean, it's a modern miracle, just because they were responsible. Just because they actually did things like sane human beings, instead of getting into this petty racialist bullshit. So Malaysia actually fixed their country and is growing stronger and stronger, because they didn't get into the secondary toxic political economy of bullshit and vulnerable narcissism and unaccountable political malfeasance, essentially, which gets politically apologized for and insured against by this disgusting cohort of racialist identity mongering and such. The modern day Ku Klux Klan Grand Dragon wizards and their colored academic colored hair and like that they have this this mystical, they are there to create the atmosphere and the ethos of this prestigious specialness, that I mean, it's, to tell you the truth, I mean, it's probably quite in the same vein of Hitler's strange moustache. It's something about the psychological manifestation of this kind of moral, weird kind of moral absolutist reductionism. Um, there's a point that I skated over. Let me try and just find it quickly. Was something that I wanted to add. Can't remember it. But yeah, so I mean, Malaysia, I think, is a perfect model of what you can actually do if you're serious about actually fixing problems on the ground. Rather than playing this game in order to kind of promote some kind of toxic consciousness and ethos, which essentially elites can play and comfortable people can play, because, you know, obviously, you know, if you're poor or in need of some opportunity, I mean, obviously, you don't actually just want a successful economy that's capable of expanding opportunity and no, you want to be given a quota so that only a very few people can succeed while everyone else is condemned to an economy that's failing and shrinking, because that's exactly what identity politics does. It's kind of like redistribution for a lucky handful, and most of those lucky handful will be politically connected. That's just the nature of humanity, essentially. And so, and as long as it happens, essentially, because it's coming from what's being extracted from uh, the scapegoat, the evil identitarian boogeymen, you know, white male privilege. As long as it's only the white males that are suffering, then it's fine. It's justifiable, because then obviously it can't. You know, it must be morally efficient. You know, it must be morally expedient, um, because they're the only ones that are losing, the white men. Never mind the tax base. Never mind, you know, how growth works. Never mind anything that makes sense in reality. The only thing that makes sense is identity. That's the only thing that matters. That's what these people are being taught. And the only way that you can believe that is if you, again, you project identity holograms onto people, uh, historical identity holograms onto your environment, and you live in this disorientating, you know, sort of ideological um, disarray until someone comes into your orbit that you can kind of uh, uh, pin it onto them. You can actually stitch them up into some kind of token mini narrative that's symbolic and that's some kind of emblematic of the giant narrative, you know, and so that you can be a queen bee in your little charade of orchestrated machination. You know, this is what is being promoted in our culture today, and this is why culture is so toxic, because essentially we have destroyed the liberal spirit. We have destroyed the spirit of the new South Africa. Um, it is dead. The question is now, can it be resurrected? Um, which, you know, there's too much that has to be done. We have to get rid of the Chief Justice. Don't know how that's going to have to be done politically, if it's going to be done at all. Somehow politically we have to remove the Chief Justice so we can get rid of this disgusting, toxic, identitarian trash and betrayal of the Constitution. You know, there's too much to do, and they do have too much power, cultural power in general. Perhaps the Western Cape removing itself from the rest of South Africa and redefining the borders of South Africa to the Western Cape, and in an attempt to preserve the supremacy of the Constitution. You know, perhaps we'll have to create an ulterior constitutional court to ratify the boundary of South Africa to the Western Cape, or whichever other provinces that will come with us, to preserve the supremacy of the Constitution, because we need to get rid of this constitutional court that is headed by this war criminal in the waiting. But I mean, but this has to be electorally tested. Obviously, it would be nice if someone could actually raise this political polemic against the identitarians, so that at least we can confirm which parts of the country are just interested in essentially continuing on this doom spiral of identitarian sabotage and racialist de facto ethno-fascism, essentially, or black nationalism, whatever you want to call it. And we also need to clean up the liberal arts, which have been infiltrated by these people that have been openly betraying the Constitution and its non-racialist values and principles. The constitutional damages that they have wrought. You see, we had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission after apartheid. Then we developed a constitution. We actually did it. We actually created a document that was capable of sustaining and maintaining a liberal society. Now that liberal society has gone unprotected, it has gone betrayed, and it has gone damaged by people, I would be amenable to having another Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I mean, as long as in whatever process we find a way to actually get this ethno-fascist gender and identity critical theory bullshit out of academia, because I mean it is rehashed, repurposed Nazi philosophy, and it's obviously illiberal, in its totalitarian, canonical presumption of being non-falsifiable. I mean, but how I do think that because no one could actually draw a line in the sand, no one could actually confront these people institutionally, and the institutions were captured by them as well. And I mean, I will not have it heard. I must say, I will. This is why I'm making my voice out, because I want them to hear this, so that they cannot use the excuse that they had no idea that they could have been damaging the Constitution. I will not have that defense be viable for them. It is, the idea that, they were confused and they were led astray by the bandwagon, that everyone else thought it was popular, that is not an excuse. The Constitution does not belong to this so-called Chief Justice, who invented the title himself, for himself, by the way. I guess, they would call that innovation, as they would call their other racialist garbage innovation. The Promotion of Equality Act, which, is ironic, to say the least, essentially, in entrenching this toxic identity consciousness into the law. Sorry, let me just finish that point. So the point is that I do wish to circumvent, by publicizing my own opinion, that they could not have merely been ignorant, that they were at least the possibility of constitutional damages for their disgusting behavior. And, to try to cite academic freedom in support of debasing and degrading constitutional values such as non-racialism, by promoting a moralistic, sociology is in some technical sense, it is a subcomponent of philosophy. It is the philosophical contemplation of society, according to according to various theories and perspectives and things like that. And if you adopt a system of interpretation in which you are choosing to reduce society down to racialist categories in order to perpetrate a moralistic, prospective, and prescriptive outlook, which is essentially a political, it's an agenda of political activism. This is not scholarly work. I'm going to also going to put in there's a very good lecture by the lady who established Quillette, who echoes a lot of the things that I've sort of outlined, in just contrasting conflict theory and what she says is, you know, the general sort of political alternative, or that she's contrasting it against mistake theory. But what I just can't get over is just how bad conflict theory is in terms of its own. It's such an obvious failing within its own worldview, essentially. I mean, except if you like its premises and its teleological, sort of goal, it should have created enough skepticism about itself within its own contemplative schema. Obviously it doesn't have any way to fix itself because it had everything that it uses, it just presumes to be true. It doesn't ever substantiate any of its fundamental operating yeah, I don't want to go into this in more detail. I made 40 minutes of recording just talking about the incoherencies and the inconsistencies and how it uses essentially this fudging of reality and morality in order to kind of get away with its how it intellectually is dishonest about dealing with issues and its interlocutors, because it cannot engage in anyone that doesn't already agree with it wholeheartedly, essentially. It can only engage with someone that it is educating to as a superior. It can't share, or it has no capacity to hear any alternative explanation and augment itself. It's it's almost like antithetical to academia. The only thing it has going for it, as the lady from Quillette stated, is that it's called conflict theory. So it sounds like it should be authoritative. That's essentially all it has going for it. Anyway, what were the things that I wanted to touch on that I didn't get into? Where the money has come from to set up this infiltration in the first place is one thing. What else? It's not important. I don't care how this came to be. I care that how it is happening is tackled, and how it is happening should have been tackled. but we had no gatekeepers. We had people asleep in the political sphere. We had idiots like Musi Maimane, who just, I I just I I wish to say more insulting things about him. I mean, he wasted time, uh, and he wasted important time that the opposition could have used to confronting this evil. And instead, he decided to join the bandwagon. He decided to fuel the fire and to get in on the same bullshit, the same kind of unaccountable politics. He thought he could be set himself up to look like a more competent kind of moral authoritarian, that he would be the savior for the identity, because that's all you're doing in identity politics, is who can pander to the identity and infantilize the identity better than the next person. There are more things that I could say, but let me just. Um, yeah, I mean, I think that's probably the worst thing that can be said about identity politics, is that it's like the welfare state for the well connected and the well to do, and the black elite in South Africa, in the South African context. It is a way for people that are already well off to try to kind of be part of a way of justifying a disgusting form of enrichment at the cost of the development of an entire country, essentially. Um, in some sense, it quite disgustingly steals from some portions of the rich, and even it seeks to disadvantage a whole section of the population just because of their identity, which aren't just rich people, which are also poor people. And it also disadvantages a lot of poor people that it, in theory, is supposed to be helping by concentrating benefits and rewards that are given to some specially uh, designated tokens that meet that quota, that found their way into the quota, while everyone else has to suffer in a worse situation of a less able economy with a smaller tax base. So it's this, you know, and the way to, and the rhetoric is essentially is that no, just ignore all the real effects, and all the real experiences of using identity politics policy. Just focus on the moral expediency and just believe that there's only black and white. And just actually forget that there are rich black people. Forget that there are rich, politically connected, plutocratic, kleptocratic black people. Those people are just actually a small fraction, and that's why we need identity politics, because those people might be stealing some off the top, but that's the only way that anything is going to change, is if we use this kind of corrupt policy, which is also unconstitutional. But because we have a captured system, essentially, and a captured morality, we're not sensitive to it. So we'll just continue to be taken for a ride as the system continues to do worse off, and as it continues to do worse off, we'll just keep on doubling down on it, and the identitarians will get stronger and stronger, just like in Russia. Just like in Weimar Germany. But in some sense, it is also how the status quo in Russia is is maintained with their kind of soft authoritarian and the oligarchs, the soft authoritarianism and that's the model that we're going towards. And you can see how politics has been reframed by identity politics to facilitate that kind of, that oligarchical kind of politically purveyed elite, essentially, where somehow the only elite that we worry about is this beleaguered, failing group of people. And I mean, they're not failing. I mean, they're obviously they're not all endemically failing, but they are failing in the context of being attached to a country which is just essentially self-sabotaging itself. Essentially, these fake ideas of identity politics, as if as if white people in this country would be capable of doing well in the context in which the country collapses. It's the idea that our fates are racially separable, on the level of identity, is just assumed. It's just assumed. Obviously, we should have this style of affirmative action, which doesn't target disadvantage, but instead just targets identity, so that it can be part of this toxic circus that just proliferates itself and facilitates a corrupt version of politics that we can never escape from, that will only ever get worse and empower people that are fundamentally unaccountable because they just say the right things rhetorically, because they tap into the ethno-fascistic sentiments which just keep on I mean, I need to find a different term, because when I say ethno-fascist, I guess I mean is identitarian nationalistic, but there's no way to say identitarian nationalistic. Identitarianism. Yeah, I guess, yeah, identitarianistic state. And I mean that is the, obviously, well, and then because journalism is so wedded into servicing that identitarian or identitarianistic version of politics, it can't even make sense of issues. It can't even ask basic questions and interrogate reality, because it's too busy trying to construct that narrative, where it's feasible to have an identitarianistic version of politics, where everything gets filtered and framed and generalized, so that you can do the same kind of moralistic hand waving, and you never get into the practical challenges of how individuals on the ground are actually meeting reality, and how systemic things happen when you destabilize a system, when you remove meritocracy, when you stop signaling within markets, because everything is filtered by this identitarian sludge and slowdown, where everything is stopped essentially by these obsessive centralized planners in government, and everything is stopped and slowed down to the extent to which that their narrative sticks. Well, of course, everything only works because of identity, because they have sabotaged the system so well that you've never seen opportunity actually scale, because we stopped the country from developing to instead pursue this other model. We have been anti-growth. We have been committed to a path of anti-growth and identitarianistic cannibalism. Identitarianistic economic cannibalism has been the policy, and it seems that it's probably not going to stop anytime soon, because, well, we don't even have a clear voice contradicting that path and contradicting that, making an alternative. There were some other general things that I should have said right at the beginning of this talk, which is that so this I think is useful rhetoric. The world is becoming a different place. Obviously we don't have the unipolar liberal order guaranteed anymore in some sense. But to the extent to which that there is still going to be a liberal order within countries and between countries, it's going to be based on if our culture can actually sustain it. I mean, we don't actually need a liberal order outside, but we do need one inside the country for sure. And it is nice to hook up with other liberal actors and voices internationally with institutions, and there will always, I think, be other liberal voices, other liberal leaning things. Um, Obviously, you have to have real interests aligning as well as values. But when real interests and political values line up, that's even nicer, um, because then you can have more dynamism and more cooperation and coordination and specialization between economies and countries and things like that. But obviously, the real interests need to also be protected and aligned, and fairness maintained and things like that. Um, but obviously, just legally, it's nicer when you can trust another country's legal system because it has the right values, because it isn't controlled by these politically, essentially corrupt and overbearing plutocrats. Anyway, my point is that the fundamental geopolitical nature of the world is changing. And, we have to start getting to grips with where we are. Like if we, we can't just sort of throw everything to the wind and because of identity politics and think that, oh, well, we've got these arguments against, these other countries, so we'll never have to pay our debts or something like that. Or, we can just continue to be irresponsible and unaccountable, and somebody else, white privilege, or the white identitarian scapegoats, well, they'll have to sit with the bill. Like that. There's always somebody else to foist it off onto. That kind of cosmic morality, which comes from the kind of the absolutist paradigm in identity politics. I mean, that's essentially what's allowing this kind of irresponsible, delusional, hysterical political bullshit to continue. Um, and so if this country crumbles and collapses, I mean, or becomes another failed African state essentially, or another banana republic, which in some sense, um, in terms of the political economy, I would say that in some sense we are a banana republic, although it would be interesting to see if we actually had a voice that challenged. Um, I think the problem is that Musi Maimane really destroyed a lot of potential political capital that the DA had because he was such a, in terms of the quality of his ideological opposition to the government, it was no different. They were just another, you know, someone, the famous economist in South Africa described, his character of the DA opposition as being ANC light, and I think that is a damning and a very good way of summarizing what the fundamental problem with Musi Maimane was, is that he had absolutely no substance, but he even had negative substance because of the identitarian bullshit that he was part of a party that was not capable of confronting itself and the identitarian vulnerable narcissists that had gotten inside of it, that are perhaps even still there to some extent, that need to still be rooted out if we're even going to have an alternative voice to this disgusting orthodoxy, which will only create. Okay. Anyway, the general sentiment that I'm trying to say is that we actually have to start creating some stability and some sustainability within our own capable state. We actually have to we can't just talk about having a capable state. We need a capable state yesterday. And the longer we defer actually having a every day that we don't have a capable state, it's like the idea is that, oh well, in the identitarian mind frame, that well, white male privilege will have will fit the bill, somehow, so that kind of is the sponge that just kind of soaks up all of the chaos in some sense, because I mean that's how the ideology works, is that you use your identitarian target essentially to fill in all the gaps in your irresponsible and unaccountable, deluded, self-deluding, you know it 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 functions just like the Nazis did with the Jewish conspiracy. That was their excuse for everything. Oh well, the reason is that your mind has been infiltrated by the Jewish conspiracy. That's literally what they. It's just like patriarchy. I mean, it's literally. It's not even slightly different. It's the same conceptualization completely. It's the same tactic. Anyway, yeah. So okay, I haven't refined that into good enough rhetoric, but that is an important point. I think that the idea is that the idea is that by not having a capable state, by not actually having a competent state that actually is capable of working off its debt, that it's actually in a position in which it's actually getting more solvent. You know, yeah, is uh, is something that should be at the forefront of politics to some degree. But somehow real politics and the political economy is just so delusional and disorientated. And it's because of identity politics to a large extent. That is what fuels the hysterical. Yeah, so I mean, yeah, I just to say almost that the nature of the world is changing. We're not going to be forced into a, a liberal international order, and so our values are up to us. And if we safeguard them, or if we fall into a kind of kleptocracy, and political plutocratic, oligarchy, which to some extent we already have fallen into, but it's not white monopoly capital. Its actual identity is black, and it uses black empowerment and black pride essentially to excuse and to disguise its its unaccountable corruption essentially. And in fact, this kind of corruption is even celebrated by a lot of the advocates and the promoters, as a kind of as a counterbalance, as a historical revenge, and or retributivism. Um, and as that kind of elitist extraction is going on, it's just completely somehow how the poor are being failed. They're not being failed by government and by government sabotaging the economy. The poor are not failed by the public sphere. They're failed by the private sphere, which is characterized as being white, while the private sphere has this huge amount of essentially middlemen, which are like part of these weird supply chains where they import things from overseas and resell them to local um, retailers and wholesalers, because that is how you uh, get these black empowerment credentials essentially, is by essentially propping up these fake middlemen essentially that aren't producing anything locally, but they are black owned. And so we basically have a redistribution system in this country for the black elite. That's what quotas get you. The most inefficient form of redistribution of wealth, which, is not, and this is what happens when you center politics around these phrases like redistribution of wealth, which is as if that is the thing that needs to be targeted. I mean, that is a theme of with that is a theme that can be read about some healthy solutions. Like some healthy solutions, you would be able to say, oh yeah, that healthy solution was a good solution, and it also did something in terms of redistribution of wealth. But redistribution of wealth in isolation is not something that needs to be tried to, is not even close to how you parameterize what you should be trying to do in developing a country. Redistribution of wealth is a secondary consequence of a good solution. It's not the primary target of a good solution. It is so, I mean, it just shows you how unsustainable the policy corruption is because of how it uses these secondary characteristics so that it can set up something that supposedly targets all the right buzzwords, and it just facilitates kleptocracy and corruption and inefficient waste of resources, undermining the entire system and destabilizing things. And that's what we sit with. Um, and this is all a direct consequence of identity politics, because it fundamentally forces journalists to sell people the false dilemma, to propagandize to people this moral absolutism. It forces people to think in simplistic terms. It forces people to generalize and to use these disgusting racialist caricatures in their mind. They live in cartoons. They don't understand anything. And that's the kind of the pliable political anti-consciousness which is being driven by mainstream media. And I guess they're fine doing that because they are used to pandering to elites, or they're used to facilitating public opinion for the elites of the day. We have just forgotten that actually the elites in South Africa are actually black. Just because, like, where yes, there are also white elites in the country, and yeah, they're not found in every place and under every rock, and they're not found in government. They're not really found in politics, um, because we've been taken over by black racialist pride and black nationalism. So yeah, where do white elites still exist? Well, they still exist in the private industry. They're only part of South African society that is still functioning to some degree of operability. It still has a semblance of rationality to some degree, that it's still functioning, um, and everything else has just been corrupted by racialist cultural hegemony and inefficient. Yeah, I mean, it's. I mean, it just so happens that this black elite have a large, poor population which they can essentially prey on and leverage politically for a political game, and journalists love facilitating that and helping them use the poor as human shields, and being as politically unnuanced and unsophisticated as you possibly can be, because it's just so easy to manufacture clickbait, to manufacture hysterical identitarian sentiment and passions, um, because I, the identitarianistic version of politics makes this kind of reliable, vulnerable narcissism, which is just so easy to pander to, because all you're doing is just updating people's snapshots and feeding them validation about their stereotype snapshots that they have in their head, their narcissistic reductions of reality for their hollow, um, because then they never have to actually worry about their ego, because their ego is protected, because the only thing that does anything are these snapshots that they have, these identitarian um, puppets and icons. And so everyone is just continually talking about these icons and describing and explaining how these icons are in this process. It's like a mythology. It's like a collective hysterical, you know, religion. Anyway, I've said enough. I'm just going to go back and sort of illustrate my main thesis and elaborate, in terms of, like, let's say the real pragmatism which could be deployed or used in a sense collectively by many nations, in order to engineer a better scenario than the one that we are likely going to be in the midst of, or in the middle of contending into reality. So when I say that people are going to look back at the liberal international order in envy and feel like it was a squandered time, in some sense, the kind of the internal politics that we are plagued by in terms of identity politics will become sort of writ large on the international scale, and this essentially tends towards the SCO powers, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization powers, essentially, and at least opens the door to have states organized politically like theirs, on these sorts of identitarian. I mean, I can only really vaguely describe it as a kind of is the ethno-state version of political consciousness, essentially, that allows the political elites to kind of to do what it wants, because it has the sacred trust which the political consciousness sort of is ensconced in, and that sacred trust is obviously the medium of political corruption and plutocracy, which is why and it's only really stable when that sacred trust isn't something that is like the more peculiar that sacred trust is, the more superficial it is, the more unwieldy the political power is. So if it's vested in something completely superficial like race, then that means that there's a great broad brush in which the elites, the political leadership, can play havoc with that superficial lever and use it to generalize out their and to scapegoat. Generally the SCO powers are have stable adversaries in well, generally it's America. In the Chinese case, it's also it's America and all foreign influence. It just shows how the kind of the ethnic version of this is very. I mean, there's a reason why Africa looks like it does, is because its politics has been mired in this form of political consciousness. It gives such wide sweeping powers to the political leadership, which is generally why I think we don't have to look past our continent to find people who wanted the Rainbow Nation model to fail. And who wouldn't mind targeting it in order to remove it as an alternative model that threatened to spread throughout Africa, as well as the success of the Rainbow Nation. It was certainly doing much better than other political models in Africa, when it was functional, at least. But now it has been overridden by this identitarianistic consciousness. Anyway, so to illustrate my point, whenever you have to deal in balance of powers, politics, you are basically wasting your time, because only the great powers care about the balance of powers. So everyone else in the world, essentially, if they are contending with balance of power politics and they're putting energy into balance of power politics, it's diverted energy, it's wasted energy. There are going to be some winners, some losers, but generally the whole system is going to be a loser, having to absorb that extraneous activity, essentially. That doesn't have to be the activity that defines the day, as it were. And so you've got a lot of this economy, political economy, that has to be diverted to balance of powers squabbling, essentially. And that makes everyone a loser, essentially. Just because it's a diversion. In some sense, it's the same way in which, within identity politics, the stereotypes are used and leveraged. The generalizations are used to make the picturesque narrative. You have to spend time maintaining this picturesque narrative and reduction of what's going on, the simplification of what's going on, in order to make the balance of power politics plausible, to make it stomachable, to make it consumable. You have to make people stupid, essentially. You have to make people believe that the issues are nothing like what they really are. You have to make a sacred cow. You have to make an iconic, symbolic investment into some kind of political pride or something like that in order to even orchestrate the balance of power politics. You have to bring in this egoistic. Now, I mean, the ego is not. When I say, I'm talking in vernacular. When I talk about ego here, I'm just talking very conventionally. How that it's the symbolic egoism, essentially, that ends up having to create this false political economy in order to sustain a balance of power politics. And instead, independent nations could not, because this is the thing, is that you can use your independence to get into balance of power squabbles, or you can use your independence to effectively stay independent. But you can only do that if enough other people are also willing to try to walk that line and create a continued liberal international order that is effectively, and we do need that, because we need that to protect democracy, because otherwise, essentially, our future is Russia. Everyone's future is Russia and oligarchs, essentially, which we already have in South Africa, politically speaking. They just, their mafia is centered around, their political mafia is centered around blackness, and this false political economy, which is completely gutted liberal democracy and liberal values. We functionally don't have a liberal democracy anymore. We have it in the most superficial sense, because essentially journalism as a whole has just been captured by pandering and peddling these false dichotomies and false dilemmas, and creating these simplified, iconic real politics within municipal politics, a version of racialist real politics that has completely removed the capacity to sense make and interrogate reality. They can't even do their job, because they're so used to creating propaganda, this kind of racialist and vile diversion, which demands policy that is, basically unaccountable power, because its simplistic, absolute moral prescriptive vision is just completely, it gives play to this false political economy, essentially. It just has a certain tax that you have to maintain the one-party state ideology, essentially, the orthodoxy of identity politics. That's so, we do, in some sense, have a kind of ideological one-party state where, even Musi Maimane, for example, was inducted into this poison. Even the opposition had thought it best to sing along to this chorus and try to posture themselves as the better paternalistic authoritarian, essentially, that he would be a better guardian of the identity, as everything becomes identity-centric. And, that, again, it means that you have a form of law which is so corrupt and disgusting because you can't challenge it on the basis of its ineffectualness. You can't challenge it and say, no, it's completely facilitating kleptocracy, that it's just, it's smoke and mirrors, because supposedly it has the right moral outlook, so it can't be invigilated, it can't be challenged, according to Section 36. Ideally, all developmental law would be if you're actually using the powers, on some technical level, if you're going to make a case of moral expediency for using certain kinds of racialized profiling in government policy, it should at least be susceptible to a Section 36 test of, is it worth it? Is it actually doing it? And it's not even, it's funny because if it were actually put under that scrutiny, none of it would pass muster, because it fundamentally sabotages the economy. It fundamentally undermines any kind of growth in institutional integrity and standards. It just throws it all out the window for some kind of racialist pride, essentially. So you use these broad generalizations that I wrote something recently. Should I even? I was disagreeing with someone who just made a very small post on Facebook saying about someone who thought that coronavirus was a fake crisis, and then he contracted it and he changed his mind. He said that. He didn't. When he said that it was a fake crisis, he said that it was blown out of proportion. But then he did like a 180-degree reversal after he got it. So I wrote this long post that just said, I disagree. The Imperial College paper has been discredited by competent experts from Stanford, Oxford, and Sweden. And I said in brackets, Professor Leonidas, who has a whole video series about all the medical details and his own papers on the subject on YouTube. Okay, so as a source of information that someone could look up. Then I said, I think Professor Sunetra Gupta from Oxford is correct about her contention that the use of test numbers as a viable source of data on the extent to which the virus has already spread is bunk, and that it must be anticipated that the true denominator for exposure to the virus is incredibly higher than the tests would even indicate. And even the population testing that was done in a town in Germany and Italy indicate that the mortality rate is around 0.1%, which would be pushed down even lower by the anticipation that those tests produce the lower bound numbers of the true denominator for the actual exposure to the virus. When you also factor in the numerator shenanigans about how comorbidity is not being properly factored in, you end up with a virus that is much less dangerous than the 2017 flu season, and was far less disruptive than the 2002 SARS outbreak. And then I put in brackets, during the SARS outbreak, South African hospitals actually ran out of ICU beds and had shortfalls in ventilators. But this was not reported on hysterically in the news, and actually represented a far greater medical disaster than the current epidemic. The lockdown is an optical illusion. The only people who should be observing it is the vulnerable section of the population. For everyone else, it's bad medical advice that is merely slowing down the natural course that this virus must take through the population. All talk about vaccines is utterly useless. There has never been a successful vaccine for a COVID virus, and COVID viruses become very inconsequential after they have made their way through the population, virtually disappearing after 18 months like clockwork. In brackets, on a side note, which is exactly when the vaccine is anticipated to be ready, which will probably end up taking credit for the natural fall off in the virus at that point. SARS-CoV-2 is much likely less deadly than a bad flu season. The Imperial College models assumed that the virus had only just arrived and that the test numbers roughly represented the denominator for the virus's exposure. This was a very weak assumption and is something like the worst possible interpretation of the weak data that was available. It was irresponsible and will never be peer-reviewed because it's frankly hot garbage, although it has been the most influential paper in terms of public policy around the world. If you apply the same standards to counting fatalities, we would have manufactured the same hysteria to every flu season over the last 10 years. Just to illustrate, the statistical data over total fatalities, clustering together total deaths with anything vaguely related to comorbidity or risk factors that pertain to any flu-related deaths, shows that there have been much less deaths in total in the population. Because you will notice that as COVID-caused deaths have increased, many other causes of death has shrunk compared to other years of collected data. This crisis is a statistically framed hoax, but obviously the media is not really capable of dissecting this sort of issue because they have been self-radicalized by the necessity of making crude identity politics false dichotomies and leveraging generalizations that are used to project onto reality, so as to make things morally simple and convenient for mobilizing outrage and manufactured public opinion, in brackets, which sadly is why it's easy for politicians to merely virtue signal their way into the continuation of plutocratic policy that empowers the generalization, which can be leveraged as disguise, at the cost of the facts and the people on the ground confronted by individual reality that doesn't conflate with the simplistic moral absolute, a moral absolute which selectively edits the interpretation of reality to fit the narrative that becomes conducted through whatever claims to represent the expedient generalization of the moral posturing. Thus, power is unaccountable and unchecked, except by the passions of the mob demanding security for any vulnerability in their identity, perhaps. Perspective is lost as everyone gets drunk on the generalized frame of reality. Any amount of hyperrealism becomes possible. Non-racialism and the Constitution has been betrayed by corrupt legal theory that has obscured the rule of law and facilitated a politically insulated kleptocratic elite. Using generalizations to shield and uphold ineffective policy that redistributes benefits to a few token elites at a great cost and sabotage to institutional integrity, which everyone who isn't a lucky beneficiary depends on for access to opportunities for work, while elites squabble to better their lot with unconstitutional laws in an illiberal political atmosphere that can scarcely even countenance freedom of speech when it is not used to promote the generalized political interests of identitarianism. In brackets, hate speech restrictions loom to further guarantee the rotten orthodoxy of this illiberal order and its doom spiral of self-fulfilling complaints and self-agonizing desolation of the drive for growth and improvements of standards. And then I put in brackets, Malaysia is now richer than South Africa because they abandoned their toxic identity politics and focused on intelligent development. Okay, some of that is a bit badly, a bit clumsy grammar, but anyway, what was I saying? Okay, so the main thing that I wanted to point out is that the you have to engineer a blind spot essentially to have Anyway, so basically, I mean, the thing that we're going to lose out on is, let's say, the liberal pressure that perhaps China did face in earlier times. That essentially we could have continued the liberal order because we could have continued to maintain a general status quo in the international geopolitical arena that was favorable to democracies, to spreading democracy, enshrining democracy in further esteem and dignity, which could have continued to do work in the Middle East and such, or at least in some South Asian Islamic countries, which would have kept democracy safe. I mean, because you see, I'm not just making the claim that it's good to try to spread these values externally. I'm saying that atmosphere is very important to preserving those values in a municipal setting. And that even perhaps if China wasn't ever going to progress themselves into having better rights for their citizens, that they would have to that they would have to conform to the democratic status quo in their geopolitical maneuverings in some sense. But instead the opposite has happened, as identitarianism injects a kind of real politics that just completely dissolves liberal democratic accountability and the form of law, essentially. So, in some sense, we have everything, but it's weird because I would say that we've institutionally we've already lost liberal democracy. Even in South Africa, we've only haven't lost it in label. We only haven't lost it in the most superficial way. But in some sense, our laws are, indistinguishable essentially from how the oligarchs run Russia. How is it different? It's not different. The state it just facilitates kleptocracy because the form of the law is in an illiberal state, is in a practically it has betrayed the constitution, and it doesn't live up to how the courts are supposed to function. But this is so I'm making a technical argument in some sense that technically we have lost the instruments of a liberal state already. But a lot of that is because of, let's say, the political consciousness and journalism, essentially. That as soon as journalism stopped invigilating reality according to liberal values, you can't really have a functioning liberal democracy when journalism has effectively been captured by autocratic ideology, essentially, or totalitarian ideology, a one-party ideological state, which is what identity politics essentially fashions. And obviously academia has set the intellectual tone for all of this. In some sense, academia has been playing the same tune forever, and everything else is sort of, because this is where the journalists were trained. The journalists were trained at universities, and that's where they were infected with this stuff. And so they basically, through university departments, they have captured society. Cynically, I suggest that I think that they were captured. Those university departments were planned to be captured by money that was put into the system, because the liberal arts was a weak target that was not able to defend itself. It didn't have the intellectual, because most people most bright people that get into the liberal arts, they go out into the world and they be a kind of a great lawyer, and they become a judge or something like that. The best minds go out and do something. They don't stay in the liberal arts academic departments, and what you get is a kind of a second-rate amalgamate of vulnerable narcissists, effectively, of mediocre minds that have invented this cult of vulnerable narcissism to maintain their prestige and to create, a superficial. I mean, there are lots of ways in which academia has failed, but I mean, against, in terms of how papers work and how institutions get money for producing papers that are cited and things like that. I know in the liberal arts, there's a fundamentally a kind of a disconnect between. I mean, it really requires that the people involved in the actual in the enterprise of scholarship are, have a kind of fundamental integrity, that they have good standing, as it were. But essentially they've leveraged academic freedom to fundamentally undermine the values of the Constitution. They have made moral activism the center of their kind of their outlook. They were captured by the meme is Russian paid political what do you call it, political ringleaders, or that set up all these marches constantly, creating all these token things, this vulnerable narcissism that's easy to, this collective borderline personality disorder, this very cozy kind of fascistic worldview in which, if you just complain and channel your identity and project your identity onto every issue and your environmental reality, that then you can expect a kind of authoritarian to come up and to pander to your interests as an identity. You just have to promise to see the world in reductive terms of the identity, that critical theory might as well be called ungratefulness theory. It's just like a requisite element of vulnerable narcissism. Okay, all right, let me think if have I added anything new. So yeah, I'm just trying to illustrate this, that so I mean, I wanted to talk about geopolitics mainly. So I mean, the thing that I just wanted to illustrate in my main thesis is that we can go down that rabbit hole internationally, which basically just becomes it's an awful, vulnerable place in which democracies will degrade themselves and will not really survive. I think in that kind of atmosphere, they won't endure. They'll endure potentially within some bounds, but it'll be rare, and they won't be able to check up on each other in some sense. But I mean, I guess the real fundamental problem is the culture itself. But also, what I just don't like about it is that, in some sense, the great powers feel wonderful because everything becomes about them again and about their balance of powers. Every issue becomes about their balance of powers, and it's just wasted effort. It's just misdirected political machinations, and there will be some small winners in the immediate. Some small countries will be strategically important, that, wouldn't it be great if that small country aligned itself with one of the great powers, and then they do so, and then the balance of powers, sort of false political economy internationally, is continues to escalate and whatever, and everyone else is locked into these kinds of mutually exclusive channels of operating, whereas instead all the small independent actors could just say, no, we won't do anything if it's mutually exclusive, but we do have values. We do have values based on liberal democracy, and we're not, and we actually feel bad about endorsing states that essentially maintain a kind of political suppression of basic rights and dignity. um, that actually withhold dignity from their populations in order to, obviously, in the context of this identitarian ideological poison that exists within so-called Western societies or liberal societies, they've stopped being liberal, and so it doesn't really effectively function. In some sense, the ideology, the identity politics critical theory enthused ideology is just functioning to debase itself, to just completely undermine the functioning of itself, or to destabilize itself. I mean, it asks specifically for disruption. It wants to disrupt. And so, essentially what comes to fill the void is obviously some kind of at least soft authoritarianism that's based over some shallow, simplified moral efficiency. And because of that because of that political economy of moral efficiency, which is supposed to be the most efficacious thing in the world, you can use that blind spot to hide whatever your rulers want to hide. You basically create a source of unaccountable power. And obviously, psychologically, it's very exciting to people because this creates an economy, an intellectual false economy of being able to create secondary arguments that maintain the status quo or that try to refine that orthodoxy, that expand the intellectual tentacles of this, sort of octopus. And you end up with a kind of with a culture that's completely dominated by vulnerable narcissism, essentially, that has an ideological form of vulnerable narcissism, and people love this. There's a large section of the population, I would say 20% of the population, which would be very happy to live in this mind frame because it makes them field marshals. It makes them guardians of their own, of policing the borders between their out-group and their in-group, and promoting the in-group morality, and projecting it onto scapegoats that make themselves available, essentially. And so it gives people a free rein to basically to make tokens out of people and to use them to vent off their sadistically edged, vulnerable narcissism. So it makes it safe to target people. And so this is the culture. I mean, this is why it gets so much traction, because it panders to a level of narcissism, which you can even see it in the media when people are watching, movies and series that are crafted for social justice warriors, essentially, for vulnerable narcissists. You can see that it's not about the story. It's about the preconceived judgments and snapshots and moral paradigm that the vulnerable narcissist audience is being agreed with, is being pandered to, is being validated and confirmed, is having their expectations and their judgments, their simplistic narrative re-stimulated, emphasized, and so it's a hypnotized sort of culture. It's you always often complain that borderline personality disordered people are constantly drunk on their emotions. It's very much like that. That is the way in which journalism addresses people. That's exactly how journalism frames their audience. Yes, the tone in which journalism addressed their audience, I would say, was the kind of the watershed of moving into this epoch. But we must remember that they were only able to do that because of the intellectual atmosphere and the intellectual fashion that was ushered in by academics that undermined our constitution. So yeah, I only hope that there is time that we can jettison these toxic elements that we can sanction them. Well, I mean, if the Constitution can ever be defended, can ever grow some teeth to excise and bite out this this recipe of disaster, of this self-perpetuating doom spiral of illiberalism, which, as it destabilizes itself, grows more and more incompetent and incapable as it continues to use these things which mean the opposite, like structural, radical economic transformation, essentially means more sabotage and more political influence. Instead of intelligent, getting out of the way of people freely acting and being promoted and perhaps incentivized, but not mandated to do things. You could incentivize smart, intelligent development, but instead we have a model which is effectively plutocrat's wet dream. But, I mean, this is the thing, that critical theory and so-called postmodernism has, and conflict theory, is ironic about all of its claims that it makes about itself. That it says that this is the only way to change the status quo. It's very ironic, which essentially means that it's completely blind to actually looking at what it itself does. It cannot assess and evaluate its own influence. It cannot track its own results of its own influence over policy. It just continues to radically double down. I have another point to add, I guess. This is sort of a minor point that's just meant to counter some of the rhetoric. So I guess what I'm trying to explain, I guess, is how, China is obviously one of the great powers, but it's only a great power in a general context in which there is no unitary order. If there is a general order that is maintained from a cultural level that values liberalism, let's just say, then it can actually perhaps deal with China without falling prey to the Chinese style of politics, which in some sense has already happened ideologically because of identity politics in people's municipal polity, political consciousness, and the municipal political arenas that exist within the so-called liberal democracies, which in functional terms I think are not really active liberal democracies. Well, not in the sense in which that they can maintain their liberal values. Their liberal values are almost, from an identitarian politics point of view, they are the thing that is being held hostage and being it's the it in some sense it's like the perverse incentive that because I mean vulnerable narcissism has to create a game of manipulation around something. So it has to say like, oh, you are pretending to hold these values, therefore you have to absorb the sadistically edged narrative that I'm setting up because you supposedly are believe in liberalism. So now you have to take on the fact that I no longer contract to really participate in the liberal order anymore. So you have to go along with me on this sadistically framed disorientation of reality, and and you have to put up with my semantic construction of radical violence and such. So it's sort of It's the same kind of thing that happened in Weimar Germany when liberalism was essentially used to help to undermine itself, because it didn't realize that you have to confront identitarian ideology because it's so wound up in its own presumptive premises. It can't be proved wrong. You can't, in the same way, um, is her name Lindsay Shepherd? The Quillette lady that explains the difference between conflict theory and mistake theory. It doesn't. It can't be satisfied by informing it. It doesn't. It's not interested in being informed about how reality works. It just wants its simplistic narrative, and it will violently, almost. It will leverage more and more pressure and orthodoxy and bullying until it destroys everything that doesn't verify and validate it. So it's a totalitarian one-party ideology kind of. Anyway, this, you know, the reason why this thinking, right, which always produces a blind spot, this was the original critique of pure, real liberalism, um, that that liberalism had against Western society or traditional society generally. Um, a critical view of the blind spot, as it were. But it's become uh, a trope of itself, a generalization of itself, in which it's not really interested in undermining its own prejudices. It's more interested in creating an orthodoxy of prejudice that it can't even question about itself. It needs that narrative to be projected onto reality and its external environment. Um, because otherwise it doesn't have this game to play where it essentially lays down traps and then runs away and then gets someone to chase them and to follow them, which would be the kind of the liberal hostage, or the liberal values that are being taken hostage by these terrorists, essentially, by these ideological terrorists and sadists and vulnerable narcissists. But okay, the point here is that China has been suffering from this as a kind of secondary consequence of its political consciousness uh, ever since uh, they brought in a kind of collectivist Marxism, sort of orthodoxy. They call it the glass heart, um, where you get these kinds of these mob manifestations of public opinion, which are very brittle and strange because they're 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 always centered around some kind of sacred trust that the political authoritarianism essentially has to pander to the identity, and so that sacred that equation, that formula, is such a cornerstone of the political um, function that it manufactures a whole secondary economy of intellectual dishonesty to balkanize and to maintain uh, that category system or whatever, And so, as identity politics has imported that category system in the West, essentially for the purposes of reifying identity as political, as the political vehicle, as the sole political vehicle, which completely destroys the individualistic paradigm that liberalism requires in order to have proper secular politics. It's essentially not secular anymore now with identity politics. It's like ethno-nationalism. In some sense, the boundaries that were usually safely, um, because in some sense it didn't matter if your citizens had a low opinion of another nationality or another um, political environment. Almost on a technical level, it's okay to have a negative opinion about how another country does politics because it's irrelevant, because you don't have a vote in that political sphere. So it doesn't matter if you have a bad opinion of it or not. In some sense, it allows you to prioritize your focus, to actually have a sense of collective responsibility, which is the fabric of liberal response, which is why borders are not antithetical to liberalism or the global liberal order. It's a prerequisite of functioning, responsible, accountable politics. Um, I mean, in some sense, this vision that you're going to essentially perpetrate nationalism on the level of racial identity groups, um, I mean, is basically the ethno-nationalist paradigm, conceptual paradigm. It's the fascistic conceptual paradigm. Um, and that has essentially come to displace authentic liberal democratic politics. And people have decided, or, well, I mean, at least a lot of the, what you call it, think leaders or whatever they're called, thought leaders, and people in prominent vocal positions, they have been blaring out this orthodoxy and this way of thinking. And I mean, this is essentially how this is the same. It's quintessentially not any different from how China's political consciousness functions. Um, because it does facilitate this unaccountable leadership and this wonderful secondary economy of vulnerable narcissism for people to intellectually use an ideology to sort of police and their in-group and field marshal and create these hard-edged, brittle intellectual technical points where you get to leverage essentially your speculation against somebody else's. So if somebody else has an alternative schema, has an alternative paradigm or perspective, you get to bully them. They are a free target essentially for not conforming, and you get to just pummel them with technical speculation, with just pure possible speculation. It's like the coronavirus thing. It's like you get all these buzzwords and you get all these the latest thing that CNN says about how to discredit like the optimism essentially of actually because all the real experts have been completely suppressed. You don't hear the people from Oxford. You only hear the people from Imperial College. You don't hear Professor Leonidas from Stanford. You instead you only hear Dr. Fauci. So you don't get to hear from the real experts who have completely debunked and discredited all of the hysteria essentially as being completely it's just inappropriate. It was always the worst interpretation of weak data, essentially. Um, but I mean, these sorts of false dichotomy, like if you say anything, oh, well, we haven't proven that, this is the kind of stuff that comes, I guess, from CNN. Oh, we haven't yet conclusively proven that antibodies confer immunity to this thing. It's like, well, you could have said that in 2002 about SARS, which was a much worse pandemic. I mean, the numbers from SARS and the virulence that SARS, the first SARS, uh, so I mean, SARS covariant 2 is by all accounts relatively a statistical hoax. I mean, how it's been framed. 2017 was a worse flu season than this. If you counted deaths in the same way in the 2017 flu season, you will find that I'm yeah, if you which you can do by essentially just counting all medical deaths that might even be remotely related to comorbidity with flu. If you just sort of because obviously the problem is that we have numerator shenanigans, and then we have this kind of this irresponsible use of test cases. We've got number of tests and suggesting that that is somehow the denominator of this outbreak, which is absolutely insane. I mean, how that could be reported on by any government is just, it's not responsible. It's not science. It's pure fear mongering. It's pure hysteria. Um, and I'm just echoing what Professor Sunata Gupta said. I hope I got her first name right. But the Oxford professor said very clearly that it's essentially ludicrous, um, that anyone is using these test numbers. And if anything, the test numbers are the lowest of the low bound of an expression of how much of the population has been exposed to the virus. So I mean, and so if you even do the town studies that were done in Italy and Germany, which suggest essentially that the case mortality rate is 0.1%. That's the low bound, because there are other forms of resilience which those sorts of tests would not be. That's the low bound denominator, because anyway, I mean, because it's completely anticipated that there's going to be forms of resilience and immunity, that there are going to be multivariant factors. And that essentially the exposure to the virus is probably much larger than the imperial, at least than the Imperial College paper essentially just assumed that the virus had just landed. And essentially just conflated test numbers with the denominator of case incident. I mean, okay, I'm roughly describing that, but I mean they roughly assumed that their positive testing was essentially was the denominator of all the exposure, which is, I mean, that's an impossible assumption already. I mean, that almost as a starting assumption is not even weak, I mean, they anyway, lies in statistics, as they say. I mean, you could have done this every flu season for the last 10 years. And the only way that we're actually going to find out the real numbers, because of the numerator shenanigans, is if we actually go back and just do a kind of total death. Like how many old people die in Italy every year, Let's compare this year with last year and actually see if there actually is a difference. I mean, maybe Italy would have slightly more deaths because their general population is so aged already. But I doubt actually that it's different to the 2017 flu season. I think if we looked at the Italian 2017 flu season, it would be less deadly. I think that at least at the end of this, looking back at it statistically, we will see this for what it was. Okay, so this is a tangent, but I mean, essentially this is what the journalism is now reduced to. This is how journalism functions, leveraging false dichotomies, false dilemmas, creating propaganda, bullying people for not conforming, not asking basic questions which shatter the narrative, because essentially, what is correct is how the audience should be feeling, and how they should be feeling is a level of kind of outrage and hysterical anxiousness. It's just this absolute fixation on how everyone should be anxious to and sort of reactive to some kind of scenario that's being essentially ideologically described to them, and how it affects their identity, and how they're not being catered to as an identity, in some kind of generalized simplification of politics, which essentially is to treat people as if they're not capable of political consciousness, as if they can only be treated as a kind of mob that's after some kind of justice for some kind of lowest common denominator within themselves. Because that essentially is how nationalism is being redirected into, or you can call it ethnic tribalism or something like that. That is how it's framed by conflict theory. that's what's promoted. And the kind of politics that you get is just the worst kind of politics, because you can't actually make sense of anything, you can't interrogate reality, you can't discuss it, you can't debate it, you can't find more nuanced issues and pieces of reality. You have to conform to the lowest common denominator, generalized way of some kind of moral absolute, which then can be expediently extracted from the system and expediently demanded of someone with power. That is, and essentially that creates a whole secondary economy essentially for these vulnerable narcissists. Okay, what was it? Anyway, so this is a depressing culture anyway. But anyway, what I wanted to get to was that China is not China. We don't have to get into balance of powers contest between China and America. We don't have to, and we don't have to be pushed around by China's model of politics, which I think culturally is already being resonated with because of identity politics. We don't have to go down that road and essentially come into this new paradigm of, big man geopolitics, where essentially, I mean, it's a kind of neo-mercantilism. I think if we don't manage to preserve some, and I mean, the kind of liberal order that I want is not what these so-called liberals and identity politicians are demanding. I mean, that's not liberalism. I mean, that's a kind of ethno-totalitarianism, and each get their own ethno-state, each get their own, at least if not an ethno-state, they get a political consciousness that is kind of multinational in some sense. And this allows politicians essentially to become a kind of unaccountable technocratic class, which are technocratic, but they're not even technocratic on the level of actually improving standards and developing countries. They have to develop identity and improve identity conditions, and which is an optical game. It's an optical illusion. So essentially, it just facilitates a kind of soft authoritarianism, and I actually, the best way of calling it is tyranny, a form of cultural ideological tyranny in which you can always vent political pressure, like China vents political pressure by blaming foreigners for things. I mean, if you look at the hyperrealism and the propaganda within China, that's how they politically deal with things. And so things never actually come, they can't be resolved. I mean, they're not being resolved in the West at the moment anyway because of identity politics, because it's so divisive, and it's such a huge giant diversion to actually getting anything done. So we have squandered a lot of time. So and in some sense it's because real liberals have not been able to debunk and confront identity politics, which has degraded everything essentially, and weakened everything. But anyway, so what I'm just basically saying is that, if already in my mind is, okay, well, first of all, we have to diagnose that this is a problem on a municipal level, on a local political level. And then internationally, we have to maybe get back to doing the good things that were happening, where, for example, Islamic states were becoming relaxed, were liberalizing, where we didn't have as much, we were making inroads in female genital mutilation, when we were actually focused on real issues, like in South Africa, when, you could actually perhaps level up and promote the informal industry instead of having this fight over a kind of elite middle management positions, and have identity politics essentially for elites to try and gain more power, where the general condition of the economy gets thrown under the bus essentially, where growth is suppressed. So it's essentially the welfare for the politically well-positioned class. for the politically connected. I mean, that source of corruption has really, well, I mean, we haven't been able to have more equality in the country across the races, uh, uh, because in the South African context, because we just haven't had growth. I mean, you can't expect people to organically, authentically, actually improve their socioeconomic condition when you have a sabotaged economy, and when it's been generally sabotaged and depressed for so long because of this elite game, essentially, of playing token politics, or playing politics around the token value of race and identity. The race card has been used to the effect of destroying the country. I mean, the original sin of the new South Africa was that we only had a government of national unity for 2 years, and they wouldn't. And there was an attempt to extend the government of national unity because it was obvious that it would have been better for the country, by far better for the country, to even extend it to 6 years. It would have been ideal, but the ANC were too paranoid, because they wanted the reins of power and they wanted to start stealing right away. And you can actually see from the capability of the state and the efficiency of the state just degraded. If we had at least had a longer government of national unity, we would have had more competent ANC officials taking over when they did fully take over and be in charge by themselves. Because, I mean, so much was wasted, not even because of kleptocracy, although there was also a lot that was lost to corruption. It was lost because of just inefficiency and ineffectiveness, and essentially ignorance about how to run a state. And I mean, and it essentially never got better because there was no incentive, because black pride was more important. The identity politics essentially was the excuse, was essentially how you got around, well, we just actually did something that hurt the people of this country and the future of the people of this country. We have done something to hurt them, but black pride is more important. So it was more important that the ANC be seen as the central controlling political power. That was more important than developing a country. And you can see that this trade-off essentially has been the theme that has mired and been the downfall of the new South Africa. And this cancer has grown and has eventually taken over. It has grown stronger and stronger because it has been the go-to excuse. It has been the convenient pressure release valve, is essentially is to just leverage black pride and leverage vulnerable narcissism and leverage, you can always just create an enemy to absorb the collective guilt. And so there's no political accountability, there's no responsibility. And you can just pretend that you're making things better because you're playing Robin Hood, but racially. You're stealing and redistributing from one group and giving it to another group. And so it doesn't matter if most of the people that are doing the receiving are politically connected people that are, like the 1% of the 1%, or this new black plutocratic elite. They go completely under the radar because essentially it all just gets conflated into a statistic of black wealth and white wealth. And so, you gut an economy, you sabotage an economy, you destroy its capacity to invest and grow and expand opportunity because you're just focused on racial statistics and racial generalizations. And this is the blind spot that is the center of all tyrannical autocratic systems. Because the sacred trust in the identity becomes the overriding moral absolute. And, everything that's happened in South Africa is unconstitutional. All of this stuff should have been challenged. It's unconstitutional, but the secondary legislation, the Promotion of Equality Act itself, is written in law the betrayal of non-racialism. It is actually a complete contradiction of the Equality Clause and the sub-clauses under the Equality Clause. it is not how affirmative action is supposed to work at all. This model of affirmative action is not constitutional. Um, and, thank goodness Malaysia, who actually started copying some of our bad affirmative action, very quickly was well advised and knew that it was, or they got on they had a change of mind, and they realized that trying to punish their minority Chinese population for holding 50% of all the positions in I think it was actually more than 50% of all the positions in academia, and or in terms of student inflow and outflow. Um, and because, I mean, the Chinese minority in Malaysia are much richer than the average Malay. And so that they had all these affirmative action quota style impositions. And then thank goodness they dropped all of that bullshit, all that toxic bullshit. And they just said, no, let's just actually just try to expand the tax base so that we have more money to invest into primary and secondary education. Because the elite in society, the middle management in society, the middle classes in society are a minority experience anyway. I mean, how many people in the population even go to university? How many people in the population actually have a university degree? It's a complete minority experience. Why are we focusing so much energy on redistributing a minority experience when we should be raising the basic standards of primary and secondary education? I mean, Zimbabwe had a brilliant education system. Their secondary education was essentially the same level as the first year university. Um, I mean, that's the one thing you can say about Zimbabweans is they're incredibly well educated. Sad for everything else because they lost their liberal politics, and so everything collapsed essentially into unaccountable tyranny. That's how it goes. And so you have in South Africa, that's what we could be aiming for. But instead, we end up we pay the same amount of money for our education than the rich Asian countries do. I mean, it's amazing the amount of money that we put into education, and the quality of education that we get for what we pay is abysmal because of the theft and the stealing and the politics, essentially. I mean, this is an essential service. This is actually so important for a developing country. And it's just been completely made, this is just part of the identity politics game, is that you can just double down on the pathetic level of service and excuse it because you can always just find a scapegoat to attach it to. Um, you don't do anything to tackle the I mean, well, this government doesn't even have the right consciousness because essentially their identity politics means that they have to let teachers be identity politician queen bees themselves and engage in their vulnerable narcissism, and so they can't be looked at. You can't do, what would the radical structural reform that you need is to actually say no. We're going to pay. We already pay a lot for education in this country. It's actually quite a well-paid vocation, um, and we're going to get our money's worth. You can't have. Uh, this is a national disaster. The state of education is a national disaster. Uh, we're going to disband. We're going to make it illegal to have uh, some forms of representation in terms of you're going to have to create like a different kind of private coordinated organization on the level of labor in terms of education, that they can protect each other in terms of some kind of legal, like that if someone comes after them in legal proceedings that they have that they've got paid up their dues, uh, and that affords them some kind of legal protection, almost like a kind of legal insurance, that they can be defended um, by their conglomerated interests of how to, let's say, push back on a cultural level. If they want teachers to be seen, if so, teachers have a kind of cultural voice by some kind of private collective organization if they want to do that. But the idea that they're going to sort of protect the jobs of teachers, um, I mean, obviously, people must be protected from unfair uh, dismissal and things like that. So you can have some kind of legal assistance and some kind of thing to look out for that. But I mean, this is the problem: is that when people are delivering a service, and there's no more personal service than teaching, um, we need to be able to get better teachers if there are better ones available. We need to make teaching a competitive industry. We need to fire teachers, perhaps, or give them contracts or something like that, and have it be a well-paid industry that is attracting. This is the thing: is you get what you pay for, and in some sense, if you just have this automatic association of tenure and this automatic, um, it's we need to see that the rights of the students outweigh the rights of the teacher, uh, the and I mean that just on the level of that. Well, there are more students than there are teachers, um, in a particular exchange, and the idea that you're going to sort of look out for the delusional identity politics version of justice in terms of the teacher, who perhaps didn't actually learn what she was supposed to learn because she didn't actually earn her university degree because it was pass one, pass all. You know, these people should not be in the industry, especially that mentality, which is effectively that toxic mentality of unaccountability, of irresponsibility, of just kind of, oh, collective guilt means that we can do whatever we want. Um, Teaching that seed of vulnerable narcissism onto the next generation, planting that retributivistic idea of systemic revenge, that never ends, um, which has grown up into this disgusting environment now, which has lost its liberal edifice on a cultural level. Well, I mean, I guess whenever I say this, I guess I'm not talking about the silent majority, if there is one, but it certainly doesn't have a spokesperson yet uh, that's openly contending against the mess. Anyway, what should I say? Yeah, so I'm kind of up in the air slightly, trying to locate the fine um, description of this point about how essentially that hopefully, I mean, this is unlikely, but I can be optimistic and hopeful. Hopefully, we will have a renaissance of liberal values, and we will have a chorus of liberal values in the geopolitical sphere, and we will not fall into the balance, into contests between the great powers, and we will not be bogged down by the balance of powers. and how they measure themselves into geopolitical, because that really will just bind everyone's hands, and then you will have more murders, clandestine things happening. The, there'll be, we haven't. South America has many stories about the depressing things that happen because of the CIA. Um, which in each and every case I can't even say that I'm completely sympathetic with, because when you take down people who are essentially some form of authoritarian, to me circumventing authoritarianism is not necessarily such a bad thing. But if such a country wants to go through the process of essentially self-sabotage, then so be it. It's actually probably better to let it happen, because then people can see by example that it doesn't work, although the vulnerable narcissist will still say, oh, it only didn't work because it was sabotaged from the outside. That's always the excuse. This happened in Venezuela, essentially. Which I think, if they had better policy, in some sense, if they had actually tried to establish a liberal form of socialist government, a radically liberal kind of socialism, which is a kind of something that hasn't been tried, something that has a hands-off approach, something that tries to, I guess it wouldn't really be socialist in the sense that I'm thinking. It would just be kind of intelligent management of government and trying to get out of people's way, but try to facilitate connectivity and coordination by intelligently laying down platforms that people can make the connections that the government wants to promote. So a kind of socialism in which there is no state mandated participation, but there is state facilitation of what is seen to be strategically good for development, or something like that. That you try to actually find businesses. The state tries to look for businesses to make deals with them to work with poor people by incentivizing that, not by mandating it. That they actually try to find an opportunity, that they're actually looking for an opportunity for people that are missing each other, which they're like ships in the night. They sail past each other, and they actually could be working together. They could be connected. So the government is trying to make intelligent bridges, essentially, not by telling businesses what to do, but by asking them, what would be really good that we could help, that we could redirect funds towards helping you do with people. So it's like a joint venture between business and government, where essentially the government isn't even doing anything. The business is doing more of it, and the government is actually funding it, and then they are just measuring the effectiveness of it, and if it's worth it, or if developmental money would do better somewhere else. And then you're actually intelligently doing things that are actually, you don't want to do something that becomes dependent, where the system needs the government to do it. You want to do something where it like levels up the situation, where you're not planning to do it forever, or at least if you are planning to do it on a continuing basis, it doesn't do it with the same people. It does it with different people, that they're actually cycling through the program, that they are going on to better things, that essentially it's like an elevator into a more functioning developing system. That's the kind of liberal kind of social thing that you need to kind of get the recipe going. Um, anyway, why was I talking about this? Oh, well, yeah, but instead they just do the same: control, subvert, slow down everything, and then just attach the narrative to it, and then blame other people for why your style of government doesn't work, instead of taking responsibility. There's just always this thread of unaccountability with this with this mentality, because their idea is that, oh, it's just the people that in charge didn't have the right vision for justice, didn't have the right, didn't blame the right people, and it's always this sort of exterior accountability, exteriorization of blame, in this kind of borderline sort of decompartmentalization and parasitic attachment, that it requires a scapegoat to attach to. It requires a host. And then as the host doesn't cope with the parasitism, then you blame the host for not being a stronger host and for not working with the parasitism better. It's because they never took the responsibility to intelligently underwrite their own policy. Somehow the policy is always absolutely right, and the consequences are always the cause of extraneous things that need to be radically condemned or managed in a more controlled way or something like that. So it's just always this escalating tyranny and control. Those things always go in the same direction. The only way to go in the other direction is to actually work out on a very basic, simple level what works and what is the light touch, and essentially what is the way to get away from creating unsustainable things that look like they're good in the short term, and in the long term they're actually completely devastating, and they're unsustainable, and they don't even fix the situation. They don't even make it any better. They just create a whole secondary economy of subsistence in some sense, and dependence on the status quo, which then is we don't even have a version of that. We have a worse version of that. We have a version of that where it looks like that they're trying to do that, but that's just an excuse to control more resources, to steal more things. And the corruption and the theft, which goes undetectable because of the corrupt moral corruption in the ideology. So you have this moral corruption, which is facilitating practical government corruption. And it's undetectable because the political corruption is in journalism, is in everything. Anyway, so yeah. What I just described is basically, actually that's what I wanted to go into. I wanted to go into the problems that China has. China has so many municipal political problems that are looming. China, and I'm not even talking about the demographic, I'm not talking about technocratic problems. I'm talking about on the level of their political structure, they are going to be weak. Because you see, the more that you become a middle income country, the more that you need a sophisticated legal system. You need legal systems that can actually facilitate complicated finances, that can facilitate complicated contractual arrangements. If you can't have trust that your contracts will be upheld in court, then you can't make complicated contracts. And if you can't make complicated contracts, then you can't have a sophisticated first world economy, essentially. China has, because of its authoritarianism, to roughly call it that, it doesn't have the nuance, it doesn't have the sophistication. It has judges that are used to following simplistic codes and being part of a culture which is always being adopted by this hysterical mob mentality, right? So it's like would you trust a court in Russia? Can you trust a court in Russia to not follow the interests of the country above the facts and issue? That's the kind of problem that you have. If you don't have a proper liberal culture, you don't have proper fidelity in your institutions. And if you don't have fidelity in your institutions because there's a giant cultural blind spot that has to be treated like a sacred cow, or an identitarian oversimplified generalizations and rhetoric that has to be verified all the time, then you don't get accountable structures and institutions that are responsible. Okay, so when you have that, that's a glass ceiling that you can't break. You're forced into a kind of mafia style way of doing business and politics as well, in terms of in how business and politics intermingle. Unless you have a proper liberal court system or culture that can actually maintain an impartial court system that actually can develop sophisticated law. That's another problem. You can't really develop sophisticated law without a liberal culture that, well, actually, this is up in the air. Okay, it's not actually up in the air. What I said is correct. The problem is that most of the West has got terrible legal systems anyway. The only good legal system in the world is in South Africa, because the Roman Dutch with the British procedural law, but I'm talking about the substantive law. The substantive law in South Africa, the structure of it, the fundamental structure of it, is the most sophisticated in the world, because we actually have real jurisprudence that is actually solving questions to problems, and it's working within general principles which always stay the same. So you actually know where you're going, and you know what's kind of going on, and citizens are actually within the culture are responsible for developing the law by actually engaging with the court system themselves. Their participation is what promulgates the new jurisprudence, essentially, the new rulings. The best country, which I would argue doesn't work well, because it uses the best legal minds, often in tribunals and arbitration, which are obviously, arbitration and tribunals are also done by expert even judges, in Germany and other countries, and then they will come to decisions, and they'll work out that some aspects of the law are messed up, and then they will kind of have a council with the politicians, and then they'll work out how to make new legislation to cover that problem until the next problem arises, and then they kind of, it's arbitrated in shadowy, dark rooms. That's how the law develops in a positivistic country with legal positivism. The law develops in dark rooms, and essentially there are forms of this which are, I think, equally bad but are slightly better, which is that essentially in America, for instance, their solution is, well, politicians get to decide what the legislation is. So it doesn't really happen in dark rooms, although it kind of half does, because what the hell do politicians know about the fine points of the law? How much fineness and finesse can they really have in developing the law prospectively as a kind of moral arbiter over society? So they have just given their legislative arm the moral arbitration over everything. Now, South Africa doesn't actually have that. The courts are actually independent, and in some sense they are a manifestation of the individual liberal outlook, and the individual's right to essentially govern the direction of the development of the law through the courts themselves. Parliament is meant to help service this. In some sense, Parliament can make legislation which can even help to structure the common law as a kind of point of reference, almost as a publicist, to let people know that this is the standing common law to some extent, so that there can be more confidence and more general acceptance about what the general status quo is before it gets ruled and changed, developed. But the courts can always override legislation. The high courts can always override legislation because they can develop the law. They are not bound by legislation. They are bound by their general principles, which essentially belong to the individual liberal citizen. So we have by far the best legal system. We have the only real liberal legal system because essentially it's the same. It's because it's the only existing remnant of Roman law. We are the only inheritors of the Roman legal substantive system. There are some elements of it that exist in continental European law, but continental European law is utter fucking garbage. It is the worst shit that you can imagine. It is like living in a kind of Napoleonic. So some of these people, that they still say, no, we've got some leftover shit from the Romans. Oh yeah, you think you do, right? Yeah, well, it's just like, oh yeah, as interpreted by Napoleonic code, as interpreted by the function of the state, by the framing of the state, in which essentially Parliament is this like strange kind of sovereign over the law. They've got such stupid window dressing, which they call Roman law. It's nothing substantively close to it. All continental law, continental European law became shit ever since Napoleon walked the earth, essentially. They all became basically what I said in terms of how America does it. They have a variant of that's less, that's more opaque. I guess, and the only exception to that is probably Switzerland, where everything essentially is put to referendum. And then you have essentially, I think, also something which I don't like, because that gets so far off from the liberal. In some practical sense, you can't argue with results. Sweden at least is in control of its own culture. But the people collectively are in control of the culture, just like the people collectively make the decision of the referendum. What I don't like about that is that I, as an individual, can go into a court and I can win the day, even if it's unpopular. You can't do that in Switzerland. That's the difference. Okay, so there I've just laid out all the different political consciousnesses. Okay, generally speaking. Oh, sorry. I was talking about China. So China, now you see, at least in some of these other systems, right? For example, the American one, where the politicians are in charge of making the law. At least then you have some arena in which the stakeholders can air their grievances. They can say, no, this law that already exists sucks. It was written by the industry, by the duopolists, by the big money power, and it's really bad. It's bad for the citizens. At least you can have a kind of political feedback against that, because it's a democracy. In China, how can you do this? You have to have complete, absolute trust in the monolithic power structure that you have to trust has a balanced view. And I don't know if you've heard about what some of the people in Hong Kong, for instance, complain, and the people in Taiwan complain about China. The things that they complain about, they call it human farming. For instance, China gives developmental money for people to make tech businesses and to make software. And then if they make that software and the software actually turns out to be groundbreaking or turns out to be lucrative, they steal it. They break their own law and they just acquire it. You see, that's the problem, is that when you have this kind of real politics that happens in a shadowy way, and the only thing protecting you is this absolute trust in the structure, in some sense, it would work if they actually had a kind of if China developed a Bill of Rights that was centered around corruption, There was a clause in the South African Constitution which was never included. I wish I could get a copy of this clause. This is not public knowledge, but there was a clause that just dealt with corruption. It was almost like the limitations clause. It was almost like Section 36, but it was essentially it was a private prosecute. It had a kind of private prosecutorial function of how someone could essentially sue the state in order to supplant or revise its policy, essentially. That essentially groups of the public or individuals of the public could make challenges and certain inquiries and have certain tests. And I think that there was it was quite an ingenious little device. I can't remember what it was, but it was some kind of almost like a bit of it had some technical mechanics in it which had to do with some kind of accounting, because the thing that makes Section 36 so brilliant is that you don't have to prove an absolute moral claim against what you don't like that is happening. You only have to prove that there's a better way of doing it. So you only have to make a practical case as to why what is happening is dysfunctional. And it had a similar kind of logic in the corruption thing, but it was thrown out because anyway, I'd rather not talk about it. But or who actually knows all the reasons why it was thrown out? Anyway, why am I talking about this? Yeah, so if China had some kind of corruption mechanism in which the state could actually be made more efficient and actually made accountable to investigation, that could be privately leveraged by money powers within China, then there would be a countervailing political pushback, essentially. Because then essentially you could actually have a functioning one-party state in some sense, because there would be an actual arena of pushback in which, in some sense it would be an upgraded version of, at least on a technocratic level, you wouldn't have that kind of blind spot. You would actually have a self-cleaning system. I still think the liberal order is a better way to ground a society. Also because humanity has to live for a purpose, and that purpose can only be arrived at with free inquiry. And the idea that the moral expediency of identitarian politics is even facilitated by destroying the liberal order and promoting this identitarian version of weird kind of transnationalism. Sorry, okay, I keep on trying to make more arguments to debunk identity politics, but it's let me just finish that thought. So what I was going to say is that identity politics, makes this moral, it tries to leverage moral expediency as to why we can't afford liberal values. But it's ironic, because if you don't have liberal values, then you get taken for a ride. Then you actually end up in a tyrannical shit show very, very quickly, and you get into a doom spiral, which we're in. Will it be recovered? Who knows? Will the South African Constitution be resurrected? But I do think that, as far as the people have not been able to stand up for their constitution, defend it against the racialist ideologues, and defend it against the race baiters and the race mongering and the identity mongering, these ethno-fascists that have insulated their kleptocratic, politically connected elite. using the poor as a human shield for their corruption. But they have done so by by the moral corruption of deviation from the South African Constitution, by being unconstitutional. And because we haven't defended the Constitution, in some sense, well, I hope historically that this is how things are framed, that this is how things are understood, that at least even if we go down in history as a very bad example of what not to do, we can understand that it was because we betrayed the values of our non-racialist constitution, and we ushered in a form of politics that was fundamentally corrupt. The government corruption that we are sitting with is a direct result of the moral corruption, which the journalists are certainly responsible for, which the academics are perhaps firstly responsible for, as they kind of created the atmosphere that sort of lured the journalists into kowtowing to them. But yeah, I mean, because we couldn't remove these academics that undermined the values of non-racialism, because they could just get away with a new form of Aryan studies, because it's called race and gender studies, which is completely identical to Aryan studies. Just instead of talking about genetic superiority, they talk about a kind of historical naturalism, of a kind of weird sort of contemplative scheme of separate but equal development for historical counterfactual, like somehow you juxtapose modern day people against historical injustice. So you get injustice that happened many years ago, and somehow the descendants of those people get to accrue the moral injustice that happened to their ancestors. You get this holographic historical projection, so that everything becomes a moral absolute simplification, in which you don't have to talk about practical measures, you don't have to talk about reality, you don't have to talk about real challenges. You can just talk about the challenge to the moral order, this weird kind of absolute morality in which everything becomes a conflated, oversimplified generalization of anything. It becomes cartoonish, so much so that rich black elites can use the poor as a human shield to continue their devastating policies and sabotage of development. Okay, well, I guess I've said all I can. Yeah, if China did that sort of some kind of corruption thing like that I just described, then they might as well go full on liberal. If you allow for that kind of pushback, then you will find that culturally people will be able to air their opinion, because it won't be dangerous to the government, because essentially the government is already vulnerable to another cultural center, for another button. It's leveraged against another. It's like there is a tug of war which balances out things, in which you know that grievances are going to be aired, that you're going to have a redress of grievances, that you're going to have a facility that actually creates. I mean, obviously, something like that wouldn't even make a difference unless you had journalism that was able to actually talk about it, and show the hearings, and if they did have kind of some kind of system of where private citizens could prosecute the government for forms of corruption, and some kind of that was bounded to some kind of interpretive sort of thing. And also, when you do something like that, you force the government to delineate its use of power. In fact, it really guarantees a rule of law, really, which is why I really wanted the original corruption clause, which was omitted. I really wish I could get a hold of that. because it's not even in the green paper. There must be a copy of it somewhere though. Pretty sure I gave it to an advocate at one time. This is irrelevant. It was such a good mechanism. Actually, I must ask. I think there is one parliamentarian who saw it. I must try and ask him.